Bonsoir tout le monde, soyez les bienvenus ici à l'Université d'Ottawa. Mon nom est Marc Saner, je suis le directeur de l'Institut de la Science, la Société et la Politique Publique. I'm Mark Saner, director of the Institute for Science, Society and Policy. I have a very simple task tonight. I'm really just here to introduce myself for 1 minute. I will then hand over the word to Gordon, who is the co-organizer. His organization is the co-organizer of tonight's event and the symposium that follows. Let me just say one thing. We have 3 public events. This is the first. There will be one tomorrow evening and the third one late afternoon on Wednesday. And like I said, the whole effort is a co-production between Situating Science, which is represented by Gordon, and the Institute for Science, Society and Policy. So I'll let Gordon introduce our distinguished speaker.
Yes, I'm the National Director of the Situating Science SSHRC cluster for the study of science from the humanities and social sciences perspective. And we're very pleased to do this rather unique event with the Institute for Science and Science Policy. And I'm given the pleasure of introducing Yves Gingras. Those of you that have been living in a cave will have never heard of Yves Gingras, but he is one of our, other than Margaret Atwood maybe, one of our great public intellectuals. Indeed, we sort of term him, when he's not grouchy, as one of great Canada's and Quebec's sages. His research in this sense spans many fields. History of science, sociology of science, and philosophy of science and technology, and his success has been exemplary in every one of those subfields. Yves achieved his master's in physics from Laval ages ago, and his PhD in history and sociology and social politics of science from the University of Montreal in 1984. And his first book, which came out of his thesis, Physics and the Rise of Scientific Research in Canada, resulted in his ascendancy almost immediately as a recognized important scholar in the field of history, philosophy, and sociology of science. Since then, he has written or written close to a dozen books and given nearly, as he says on his website, nearly 2,000 conference papers. His books include The History of Sciences in Quebec, which is a prize-winning book on the history of science in Canada. And I can mention his paper, which I was at the Dibner Institute for the History of Science at MIT back in the day, when he composed this definitive book, or a paper on the social and epistemological consequences of the mathematization of physics, which won the Ivan Slade Award for the British Society of History of Science. Well, look, his achievements are legion. He is a Canada Research Chair. He is the major co-founder of the Observatory of Science and Technology at the University Center for Research, Inter-University Center for Research on Science and Technology, CIRST, where he was director from 2001 and 2002. He is indeed a public intellectual. His regular contributions to Radio Canada are now being published as a separate book. That's right, soon. And it is in his capacity as one of the major commentators on science and technology in our modern world, as one of our premier commentators on the relationship between science and society. We're very pleased to have Yves speak on the very issue that is driving this symposium, the transformations in the relationship between science, policy, and citizens. I give you Yves Gingras.
Thank you very much for this presentation. It already shows that people never listen to me, because I told my good friend Gordon to be short and not overemphasize, not insist on too many things, but this is part of the academic thing, you know, easy ethnography of academics. We know that we are all excellent, we are all very good, and we have to do that because we live now in an era of excellence. Ask your VP research, ask your rector, we must be excellent. So I'm not, but I have to say I am, because otherwise they will not invite me here. So I accepted nonetheless, because I think, okay, we will be talking for 2 days about the transformation of the relationship between science, society, and policy. So I thought it would be a good beginning to try to give you what I think is the landscape of the transformations that happened over the years, up to where we are now and where we come from. And where we come from, very briefly from the 17th century, because we all know that, but I think it's important that we moved, in fact, from public science to private science. Because from about, say, 1600 to 1750, there was a very low barrier to access to science. Amateur, what we now call amateur, because of course I won't do the sociology of it, but we must be conscious that when we use the word amateur, it's a construction from the professional. There's no amateur in the 17th century. There are natural philosophers, there are physicians interested in optics, in astronomy, in everything. There are priests, a lot of Jesuits doing science. They're not amateur, they are natural philosophers. And the classic book of our friend and colleague Larry Stewart from the University of Saskatchewan is exactly about the rise of private science from about 1600 to 1750. But then there is a second part on which I think less has been written on, which I called in part a section of the paper that he mentioned about the social and epistemological effect of the mathematization of physics. I had a section in honor to Larry called The Rise of Private Science. Because there was a rise of private science. And just to give you a very brief example, you can recall that if you go back as early as 1900, between 1896 and 1900, with the discovery of X-rays, it was still public science. Because every high school, every college across the world could rush after the discovery, take a Ruhmkampf coil, a battery, and do X-rays to see through priests, like in Quebec City, for example. The rector was a physicist, but also the rector and Monseigneur Laflamme looked through priests directly with his Ruhmkampf course and was interested in X-rays. So it was easy to do science at the beginning of the century. But of course, there was a rise through training, part through mathematization, part through instrumentation. We could give the example of chemistry at the end of the 18th century, when Lavoisier was in fact a tax collector, was so very rich as collecting tax, had big scientific instruments that nobody else had. And some complaints, like Priestley, that discoveries made by the apparatus of Lavoisier could not be taken as proof as long as all the others who do not have the same instrument could not repeat this with simpler instruments. So he was conscious that something was going on when you need so-called big science. So there is a move toward privatization of science. So now we live in this time of essentially private science. But now, over the last years, we have been talking about a return to public science through what is often called citizen science. So we'll come to that. But what happened now is that for a long time, essentially since 1945 to go fast to 1975, we had what we can call a first social contract between science and society, which is usually presented as incarnated in the document published right after the Second World War as a report to the President of the United States by Vannevar Bush. Because as you know, during the Second War, all scientists were engaged, were enrolled in ending the war. So toward 1944, they said, yes, we know the war will be ending about in a year. What do we do with all those scientists who are on tap and now they have to go back to do something? So they asked Bush to write a report. And this book has been celebrated as the kind of social contracts of the Republic of Science. Okay? Science, the Endless Frontier. This is a typically American title. You know, the American imagination was the frontier. After they went to the West by getting rid of all the Indians in between, they arrived at Pacific Ocean, so that's the end of the frontier. So in 45, Bush was bright enough to say, no, there is another frontier, and it's an endless one. It's science. That's the imagination which made this report a classic one. But of course, this report, we can say, as a validity was valid for 30 years, the 30 glorious, 45, 75. But in fact, it's just the contract. It's not a new thing. It's the professional ideology, spontaneous professional ideology of the scientists, starting with the notion of pure science in the 1870s. And in Canada, since our culture is quite different from the US, in fact, this Republic of Science was incarnated as early as 1916. We don't need Bush 1945 report to understand the Republic of Science. We need it to understand the origin of the National Research Council in 1960. And already from 1916, the National Research Council was supposed to do the organization of the relationships between university and industrial research. So they take the best scientists at the time, John McClellan, Department of Physics from Toronto, people from McGill in chemistry and physics. They sat around the table and they realized that there was nothing to coordinate. They said, if we add up all the research and development across Canada in 1916, it adds up to the budget of the MIT. So they said, okay, there's nothing to coordinate, let's create things. So in fact, the legacy of the NRC was to say, if we give money to pure science, ipso facto, and I cite them, ipso facto, we will get applied science. So the famous linear model that you start from pure science, you go to application and you get innovation, is the spontaneous views of the scientists. It will be put by Vannevar Bush in a book that will be read across the world, but it does not begin there. It's already institutionalized in the National Research Council. And this thing is this view of the Republic of Science. How does it work in terms of policy? I think it works a bit like that. Of course, like any model, it's a simplified one, but it's pretty close to what was a long time in practice what scientists like. And in fact, this model even explained, a contrario, their reactions now to what I would call a new contract for science and society, which is quite different from this one. So you start from the citizen, and what does he do? He elect representative, like Harper. Okay, it's democracy. You elect a conservative government. Then the government make decision, finds its priorities. For example, last week in Quebec, they have a new national science and innovation policy. It's a document of the government. He decides on its priorities. He announces them. And then you have this Republic of Science, where you have granting council. And here, it's the National Research and Engineering Research Council, and CERC, Social Science and Research Council of Canada, and Humanities, CERC, and CIHR, the Canadian Institute of Health Research. Usually up, at least to the 70s, it's okay, we think science is important, we give grants to those organizations, they make peer review, they give that to the best experts, because they are the one in the know. That was the view of Bush also, that scientists know who's the best, give us the money, tell us on which domain, okay, physics, chemistry, blah, blah, health, but you don't choose, we choose through peer review. Then you have research activity, and then we hope you have a feedback on the citizen, healthcare, new technology, cell phone, everything. They will say it comes through this endless, not frontier, but endless cycle between science and society. This is based on a belief in some basic characteristics of science. The relative autonomy of science, that there is an auto-regulation of the scientific enterprise, and an internal validity. If someone tweak the data, someone else will repeat and say, I can't repeat. So there is this belief that there is an autonomy of science. It's not policy, it's not politics who decides the truth of for example, at random evolution. Okay? It's not a politician who decides if the theory of evolution is right. It's supposed to be the scientist or a set of experiments. That's one of the basic characteristics in this model. And it works always on a dominant paradigm, be it classical physics, quantum physics, cell theory. You look at the world through the paradigm of cell theory, and when a revolution arrives like the prion, where we have not a virus, but a molecule that behaves like a cell, living things, people react to that. Nobody believed in prions for years and years. And also, and this has been all the work of the French philosopher Gaston Bachelard, is that when we look at science, the way it develops, it very often goes against common sense. Science, relativity theory, when it came out, goes against common sense. Some reacted, hey, we don't understand relativity theory. Yes, but who said you should understand it, in fact? Okay? And because of that, they prefer some in common sense, they prefer that. Science is not good on common sense. Quantum mechanics is the negation of common sense. A lot of things are negation of common sense. And because of that, it's much more difficult for amateur. There's no real place for amateur there. Of course, except if we need small hands in botany, bird watching, but small things like that. And it's very conservative, of course. Kuhn said it in his book on the structure of scientific revolution. Science is a conservative system. I give just the example of the Helicobacter pylori that you may know, that no physicians believed in that. Those Australian physicians had to test those things on themselves, show that it did, in fact, was this microbes that was the source of stomach ulcers. And they finally got the Nobel Prize, which is the proof that they're right for the scientists. Now they believe them. And of course, the other case that I come to mind is the liquid crystals, which is a kind of contradiction in terms for physicists. A crystal was something solid with bonds, regular structure, until we found liquid crystals. And it took time to convince scientists. So science is conservative. So this system of the Republic of Science and this implicit nature that scientists knows gives us what I call the principle of the doctor knows best, okay? You look at the poor young daughter, she is silence, anxiety, and she's waiting for that diagnostic, and then they will move accordingly. But then in the 60s, we have the awakening of a critical thinking on science for many, many reasons, of course. We had this famous book, 1962, Silent Spring. Rachel Carter says, look, science and all those benefits, there are drawbacks to that with chemicals, DDT, stuff like that. So it launches what will become, of course, the ecological movement. It takes time. It's not the year after 62 that everyone says, hey, it's dangerous. It takes time. But 60s and 70s are the awakening period. And I will give another book, which is very important in France, Autocritique de la science, by physicists, 1973. Those were active physicists, not left-wing pseudo people who never talk about science. This guy is a well-known physicist, got prizes in physics, and said, okay, that's enough. Now physics is too much in the service of the military. And one in 72 or something like that, Murray Gell-Mann, the inventor of quarks, went to Paris to give a talk on physics and elementary particles. The gang of friends of Lévy Leblanc went there and said, before you talk about quarks, let's talk about Vietnam War. Let's talk about the JSON groups who work for the army, who created the bombe à billes, the napalm, and everything. So Gell-Mann says, no, here we are in the physics department. I talk about quarks. They said, no, you will not talk about quarks. If you don't talk about politics now, you get out of the place. So there was a big uproar. There was no talk on quarks. So it was a really critical time when they say, you cannot tell us that here you talk about quarks, and in society there's Vietnam War. We don't want that separated as smoothly as you think we should, for right or wrong. But that's the 60s and 70s. Times continues, and then we were used to have trust in experts, okay? We have trust in scientific journals. Eh? We read, hey, every journalist says, yesterday in Nature, they said that. In the latest issue of Science, they said that, which means it must be true. But then you have journals like Australian Journal of Bone and Joint Medicine, Australian Journal of Cardiology, General Practice, Clinical. And this is, in fact, a series of pseudo-journals created by Big Pharma. This has been shown by court proof in Australia. Okay, so we say, okay, do we believe in those scientific journals? And then now we have scientific societies. We are used to say, okay, according to American Association for the Advancement of Science, this thing and that thing. So let's look at those, very interesting. We are all for greens, we're all for greens. It's like apple pie, we cannot be against that. So I would like to put my money in the Global Climate Coalition, because I don't have the time, but they are good to do that, or the International Council for Environment. Until someone showed me that, in fact, it's a front from the petroleum industry, okay? And what is junk science? We are all for junk science, all against junk science. But when we look at it, junk science is any science that criticizes industry. So it's a kind of Orwellian discourse that junk science, you cannot be for that. But junk science, the way it is defined by the petroleum industry. So this can explain that the thinkers behind those things are in fact think tanks. The Cato Institute, the Marshall Fraser Institute in Canada, people like that. This explains that someone as well known as the former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, Marcia, can go so far as to write in the New York Review of Books, it's no more possible to believe in published research or to trust the judgment of family journals. So trust us, we're experts, is no more the order of the day. So we have, in fact, a new social context which is related to that on the long term. Compared to the 1940s, 1960s, now it goes, right. There is a rise in conflict of interest. Just think about university-industry relations, Nancy Olivieri thing at U of T. We can multiply those games across the country and in the United States and across the world. But we have also a generally better educated people, less naive, more critical of science, not because they're against science. And this is something I think which is a misunderstanding of all the polls on science. Very often in the newspaper, we say, oh, you look, polls shows that people are less trustworthy of science. They are more and more critical of science. And they see that as a bad thing. I think that when you look carefully at the data, they show something quite different. They still believe first in scientists and physicians much before politicians, journalists, and any other. But instead of 100% credibility in those people, they would go to 80%, which is a sign that they show a better autonomy on themselves. They say, we believe in scientists, but now we'll argue with them. But we still believe it. So I don't believe there is a decline of belief in science. There's a more critical dialogue that they want because they are more educated and less naive about it. And, of course, there is a much greater facility to diffuse marginal points of view through website, YouTube, Facebook. I won't call Twitter yet. And, of course, you have now many socio-numeric media who create from the scratch or consolidate special interest groups. Things about medicine. You have Doctissimo in France, Patient Like Me in the States, where if you have a bobo, you can go on the web and try to find people like you who have the same problem and then exchange and crank you up to try to convince someone to change things. So there is a new social contract around, and it has been as much as the 1945 Bush document was the kind of incarnation. Here is a European document, Society, the Endless Frontier, which is, of course, the exact answer to Bush, the Endless Frontier. Science, no more science, but society, okay? And this is a document of the European vision of research and innovation policies for the 21st century, so around the turn of the century. So that's where we are now. And now, of course, a lot of work on sociology of science try to name this thing. Okay, so they say, okay, what is this thing? This new social contracts. Is it post-normal science? Is it post-academic science? Is it mode 2 science? Is it, some even call it post-modern science, which is the worst stupid joke I heard. And so in fact, the old social contract was like that. Here is, again, as kind of macroscopic summary, here's the new social contract. In the old, you follow this kind of linear belief. In the new, you have a lot of new red things coming up. You have, of course, those pressure groups, the patient groups. They go directly into government priorities through lobbying. They go directly now as member of committees, things about mixed committee review, consensus conference, a lot of kind of organization that emerged in the 1990s and are now around us. They are opening up the Republic, and now they have access directly to decision-making through committees, which is something quite recent compared to the old view of the Republic of Science. And you have also direct intervention from government. I'll give just one example of this one. Take the 2007, I think 2007, or even the latest Harper budget. So the conservative government at the federal level in the latest budget announced in the budget, contrary to what we used to see in the past. In the past, the budget would say, yes, science and innovation is important for society. We give 500 million to the Kenyan Foundation for Innovation. We give 200 million to the Genome Canada because genomic is the future. We give X amount to NSERC because basic science is important, blah, blah. That's what we used to read. Now, they mentioned in the latest one, we give $50 million over 5 years to the Perimeter Institute, directly. Okay, that's fascinating. It means that people doing the research activities at the Perimeter Institute just went to see the minister, convince it to put that in the budget, and in this way, they don't have to fight peer review at NSERC. You just get the money directly from the minister. That's something quite new in Canada. Pork barrel was very well known in the States, not much in Canada. It began in 2005 with the Conservative government. The first budget also gave Perimeter Institute money. So it's the new approach. And there is a big erosion of trust. And Sheila, who will be talking tomorrow morning, was saying public doubts can't be erased by simply transferring knowledge. So it's part of this new contract of science. And now it raises kind of skepticism because, it takes Hubert Reeves, a well-known physicist, not much, I guess, in English Canada, but in France, is a hero. He's the incarnation of l'Abbé Pierre, a very high-level popularization of science. He writes books after books who are very, very well-known in France, and he's a Quebec scientist, so he's very well-known in Quebec too. And now he has, and of course, as a physicist, he's more been 80s, he's for new trees, for ecology, and he's a very nice guy. Then, of course, someone created the Institut Hubert Reeves. I would be glad to do someone say, hey, Gingras, I want to create the Institut Yves Gingras. But then you realize that this famous institute behind it was, in fact, the mining industry. So he had to say, no, you won't be able to use my name on this. But at first sight, he was a nice guy. He said, I didn't ask much question. He asked me to use my name. And scientists in general, and academics and intellectuals in general, works, I will give you the secret, not on money. They works on symbolic capital. They like that they say they're good. They like to be said they're brilliant. So if you see Hubert Reeves, you're brilliant, I want to use their name, he says yes. Now you realize that you should make some inquiry before saying yes. So there is a real problem. And now, same thing. In Quebec, there was a coalition called, very nice coalition, for work, for research on cancer. Who's against research on cancer? Nobody. But then people scratched this organization who pushed, and they realized that who's behind priority to cancer, it was pharmaceutical companies who use those groups to convince the government. So who should we believe? So there is a real problem. Then there is the generalization now of pressure group who want to have the government intervene on their problem. The well-known case in sociology of science, of course, was the case of the work of Epstein, who works to show that in the case of AIDS patients, they played a very important role in the States to change the way the research protocol were done. And so they wanted to have a say, not only as subject to be used by scientists, but to discuss with themselves, to change the rules and participate in the priorities of the research topics on finding a cure to AIDS. But it's not only the case for AIDS, it's the case for cerebral palsy, autism, and also on many. So there was a lot of paper a lot of articles in the newspapers. And in the case of cerebral palsy, which is not much known, even one of the guy activists says, in fact, we lack a strong group pressure as the other one to convince government to invest in those things. So one case I will look more in detail is the case of the Zamboni treatment for multiple sclerosis. There is a very nice graph there that shows that for some reason, the number of kind of a measure of articles and talks about this treatment, which is non-conventional treatment for neurologists. They think that it's not a good treatment at all. In fact, the guy is not expert in neurology, he's not a neurologist, so it's not, for them, he's not part of the group. So it's in Canada where we have been talking the most about this. Most countries not talk much about it. So it's in Canada and in Italy, of course, because Zamboni is an Italian. So what happened in Canada is that people who have this problem saw that, in fact, there are a lot of people on the web. You go on YouTube, you can see people who say, I've been liberated by the Zamboni treatment, now I have no problem, I've been treated by the Zamboni. So, but physicians says, we doubt this. We don't believe it. It's not tested scientifically. There's no peer review of this thing, blah, blah, blah. So they use the usual conservative argument of the scientists. And you have a lot of articles. We are in March. Look at the dates. March 2011 was this, September 2010, April 2011, the Zamboni treatment is much discussed. And then in June, the minister says, okay, we will put money to make a test of the Zamboni treatment for multiple sclerosis. And so he said to the CIHR, which the year before were saying, that's not serious stuff, we don't have much money, there's no reason to test this treatment, it's not a good treatment. Here, it's a document released by the Canadian Institute of Health Research. They say what? The government of Canada launches a request for research. My take is that if you go on the website of the CIHR and look at the press release, most of the time they will say, the Canadian Institute of Health Research is launching a discussion, is launching a program of research on AIDS, a program. Now they say it's the government of Canada, it's not the CIHR. I don't think it's a slip of the pen. I think it means something about who was taking the decision. And you could take another example, which is a very recent one on stem cells. There's a very problematic treatment of stem cells in Italy that scientists says that's bogus, don't waste your money there. But the parliament, because of the pressures, no, we give 3 million and you test the thing. That's the direct link that I showed first. And there are plenty of articles. There's one there at the end, MS doctor, multiple sclerosis, attacked for their skepticism. So even the doctor who said, that's not a serious treatment, you should not try that, it's dangerous for you, have been considered. So now we know that that's finished, the idea that the physician knows best. We have to debate, argue more in detail why you think I should not take this treatment. That's a big transformation. A good example, I think, is this one. You may have known this big debate in science. This woman, Judy Mikovits, has been working for years on trying to find an explanation to the chronic fatigue syndrome. Very well known, but we don't know exactly what's going on. And what's interesting in terms of kind of phenomenology of sickness, when there's no well-known reason you're sick, you start to begin that people think you're crazy, okay? And that's interesting because there is this plague, it's the virus XMRV, she could add stupid, okay? It means that I'm not crazy, now I know what I have, it's a virus. The problem is that they call me every single day. I spend so much time trying to understand the patients, to understand them and this disease. So she has been totally taken in by those groups, and she believed in the truth of her experiments. But many retrial of her experiment shows that, in fact, the results she got cannot be reproduced by anybody. So it took a couple of years, and lately she accepted. She said, okay, I'm wrong. All the tests has been shown. But it's interesting that the distance that the scientists used to add, you look at bones, old bones, you're kind of objectivating them. Now she was no more able to objectivate them. She was taken up by those who says, you found the answer. And many of them still believe that it's the XMRV virus because they want to have an explanation. Otherwise, syndrome fatigue looks like you're lazy people or you're just crazy. So there is a strong interaction, to use a term from physics, strong interactions now between citizens and scientists. So this raises a difficult question. Are there kinds of science? Okay? It depends how do we use adjectives. Kinds of science means that we have the word science and we put an adjective, a qualifying term before it. So we have good science, I guess, bad science, useful science, useless science. But is there such a thing as citizen science, term that has been launched by this book in 1995? Or was just a bad use of English to, in fact, mean, it's fucked up, to mean science for the citizen? It should appear, but it does not appear there, okay? Yes, there's there. Science for the citizen, we can understand. You have science, it can be in the service of the government, can be in the service of the citizen, can be a service of the industry. We make some, can there be such a thing as citizen science? And I think that in the discussion, there have been many discussions on this, and tomorrow we have a whole panel on citizen science. So this is kind of introduction to that. And I think that in discussing that, we have to remember something which has been done by a philosopher, a great philosopher, Austin, that words matter. And the great book by Austin is How to Do Things with Words, which reminds us that words have a performative effect. When you say some words, you don't describe the word. You want it to become the way you want. That's the performative aspect of discourse. And there's also this famous book that is around us every day now, 1984. Not because of Big Brother, but because of the newspeak. Big Brother is the one thing that people remind from 1984. I think the most important thing is newspeak, where war is peace, investment is cut. Okay, that's now we live in this world. So when I start with Austin and words means things, is there citizen science? This reminds me of Aryan science. That there was Aryan science. Philippe Léonard wrote Deutsche Physik, or American physics, or Quebec physics maybe, at some point. And he was one of the great physicists of the time. And he believed there was a kind of science. It was Aryan science. There was another kind of science, proletarian science. Trofim Lysenko was against the bourgeois biology. And he was a very good friend of Stalin, of course. But there is another meaning of this. It's the Manifesto for Citizen Science, le Manifeste pour une science citoyenne. It's a manifesto of 1999. I made a brief summary in English for you. But in fact, he has principles. That's very interesting. He said, okay, I don't know what citizen science is. You understand, I think it's bogus. There are just good or bad science. But a citizen science for them is a science where we accept that there are never a unique scientific truth. Never. Scientific activity should be part of social contract to the service of society. Who is against that? Nobody. Right? Who is against being for society? Nobody. It's like the apple pie. Who don't like the apple pie except me? Not much people. Oh, again, scientific activity should be guided by wisdom and not power. That's a good citizen science. And the precaution principle should be proportional to the uncertainty, which makes sense and is, in fact, used by many. So instead of talking about citizen science, which is a sleepy term that can have dangerous, unconscious consequences, I think we should use other words. For example, we can talk about collaborative science, but it's not a good one for the one who talk about citizen science because collaborative science is already collaborative. We know more the 19th century with Lavoisier or even 20th century with Einstein, where in big groups working together, now all scientific papers have more than one author. 90% of all scientific papers have more than one papers. And even in mathematics, half of the papers published have two authors at least. So the idea of the alone scientist in his office is a thing of the past. In biology, there's not a single paper except a review paper written by assistant and signed by the head of the department, of course, but most of the time are team research. So participatory science is a term that now is more and more used in France, la science participative, because participation is the idea that there's a lot of people around talking to each other. So there's the idea of heterogeneity in participation. So it's a better term, but also it depends on discipline. Part of the problem I have with some of the literature on this is that they talk about science as if science existed and it could be discussed in an abstract way. There's no participation of people at the CERN because there are 6,000 physicists to create a Higgs boson. There's no place for amateur. But if you look at bird watching, in fact, you need those small hands that will check the birds when you're sleeping or when the birds get out of your yard. So you need them. In astronomy, astronomers don't look at the star, no. They do astrophysics, they don't do astronomy. So astronomy is for the amateur. They find new aurora, they find a lot of very important things, and they have a place. So we see that participatory science has been in a very limited fields where the cost of access is not the same as in other fields. But mostly they are small hands helper to scientists who get the credit to their publication grants and prizes. Of course, they will say thank you to all those who helped me. Conclusion. So can science be democratic? It's a big discussion. But if we ask, can science be democratic, we have to ask, what does that mean to be democratic? What does that mean to be citizen? What is such a thing as society? Okay? I'm not a fan of Thatcher. But Thatcher said something I think was perfectly right. She says, society does not exist. People went crazy. She's crazy. I said, no, listen to it. Society does not exist. What do we have in society? We have a lot of groups. We have the scientific fields. We have the political fields. We have the economic fields. We have the family, the way it works. It's a pre-capitalist thing where you help each other by gift and counter-gift. And you have the capitalist society where you pay for everything. So it's not society, it's a very stratified system with interaction between very different fields. You have the religious fields. So it's impossible to analyze society. But we have in society mixed forums, which are existing, as I told you now, you have consensus conference. There's a lot of new groups in society that are helpful to raise questions that in the past said, the doctor knows best. Now the doctor does not know best. We go to the doctor after having went on the web and we have a list of questions to him. Should we buy this new pill? Why don't you give me that pill? He will have to explain to you that he's right or not. Or he may even change his mind after going himself on this same web. So we have things are changing. And those mixed forums, and I don't say, in case a question come on this, I say mixed forum, not hybrid forums, because I don't think they are hybrids in the real sense. They are mixed. Mixed can be unmixed. Hybrids cannot be defeated. So hybrid forum is a performative discourse, not a descriptive one. So I use mixed forums because a mix can be demixed, if we can say. So it provides exchanges, and it also forces leaders of scientific community, which are very often enclosed in their paradigm, to seriously evaluate and test new avenues that seem impossible to them. The very fascinating thing with the Zamboni treatment is that from a purely classical epistemology of the positivists, those who force to test the Zamboni are the more scientific, because they are saying to the scientists, hey, you think you know that the Zamboni does not work, you have not tested it. No, but you know, it's incompatible with neurology, blah, 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 the myelin. And I said, no, you have not tested it. And basically, at the end of the day, you have to test it. So it's a paradox that those groups put pressure on the government to do science, where the scientist says, we don't have to test this thing, we know it. So it's good to have those group, those forums, in practice in some cases. But it can also help because radical new ideas, as I said, often come from outside of the box. Not always, but from time. The problem is that there's no general rule on this. So we have to go case by case, and there's not such thing as a science should be democratic. Can the demonstration of the latest Poincaré theorem be a democratic thing? Of course, it's nonsense. So, in fact, decisions are always the results of a struggle between competing interests. We see it in Canada. We see it with the conservative government. He has his priorities, which are not the one that many scientists have. So they just have to understand that they have to decide for whom they vote the next time. So there are political interests, economic, ideological, religious interests. Those are clearly in society, and they're debating. So there's always a danger, I think, in trying to enroll science in the abstract science, in the service of an ideology, even one that presents itself under the guise of the citizen. An abstract notion that is always manipulated by interest group. When the government wants to say something, he says what? He says, the population says that. Of course, it's a lie. The population never says that. It says many things. And he listened to one of them, so he's deaf to many of those citizens who have a different discourse. And in the end, and that's my conclusion, the reason why we have to take care is that hell is paved with good intentions. Thank you.